about where we are and how that history has an impact on the garment industry and the fashion industry. You can kind of fast forward to about 600 years ago when that Portuguese ship showed up on the west coast of Africa and the Atlantic slave trade began. All of that knowledge, skill, whether it be weaving, whether it be dyeing, whether it be the fiber cultivation for the industry, was transferred to first, the Western Hemisphere, but the southern part of it. Slavery existed there for 200 years before it became a thing in the northern hemisphere, in North America. But all of the knowledge and what was lost in that was the ownership of value, creative value. That's what we lost. When you get to the slave experience in North America, you can segment that into different periods. The colonial period, the antebellum period, Jim Crow, and right up until this current day. When it comes to the knowledge that was transferred, the skills that were transferred that relate to, again, weaving and dyeing and fibers and garments, the making of those garments, certain things happened during those periods. Now, remember, we transitioned to the agrarian economy that was driving everything. That's what we provided. We provided a source of free labor, land, labor, and capital. So they took the cost of labor out of everything. We did not own the value. The knowledge and skills that went into clothing was not owned by us. And you can look at laws from that period. The South Carolina Negro Act of 1735. The South Carolina Negro Act of 1735 said certain things. One, you could not learn to read or write English. But it also said that it was mandated for you to wear Negro clothes. There's a place called Loyal, Massachusetts, where guinea cloth and Negro cloth was made, burlap. Now, can you imagine wearing burlap in the South Carolina sun, day in and day out? But the skills that you brought, you no longer owned those skills. You no longer owned the value that was created from those skills. 1735. Now, and I'll put certain things happened during each one of those periods. That's the colonial period. Even up to 1786, there was a young lady by the name of Charlotte who was a slave girl, 20-some years old, who was a seamstress for Martha Washington, the First Lady of the United States of America. And she had the audacity to put on a gown called Indian chintz. It was the finery of that day. But remember, those skills and the knowledge of sewing and making garments put you in a little bit of a different class, because you were clothing not only yourself, if you happen to have those skills, but you were clothing your master's household. So the gown that she wore, the chintz gown, She wore it in Alexandria, Virginia, walked down the street with this gown on. The gown was stolen. It had been stolen a couple of years ago by a seamstress who worked for, I think he owned the ferry in that area. And it was stolen from his wife, sold to a seamstress, and then sold to Charlotte. Charlotte had the audacity to put on this fine gown and walk down the street of Alexandria, Virginia. The original owner saw her in the gown and said, "That's my gown. That's my gown. That's my dress. How did you get this stolen dress?" And Charlotte did not genuflect. Remember, she's a seamstress. She's working for Martha Washington. She didn't feel it necessary to back down from the conversation. So her husband, the original owner's husband, wrote a letter to George Washington about what he thought should happen to Charlotte, this young 20-something slave girl. Now, I tell that story to, one, hopefully you will think about the long trajectory of the development of the industry, but also how the skills and knowledge that are required for the industry we lost the ownership of them. But even in that, we were still fighting. So I'll stop there.
And to build on that, I mean, the idea of ownership, obviously, during the period of enslavement was, it wasn't something, it was hard to dream of, right? It was hard to even think about, but it was still possible in very small ways that built really the foundation of other Black people, of later descendants, even today to look on and marvel at. I think about, to your point about this young lady, Charlotte, designed or being a seamstress for Martha Washington. I think about Elizabeth Keckley, who was the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln, right? And so her creating many of the fashions that at that point in time photography was invented. And so you saw a lot of who Mary Todd Lincoln was out in the public sphere, and what she was wearing primarily was made by a Black woman. But it's interesting that her story, specifically someone like Elizabeth Keckley, her story didn't necessarily end in, a trail of glory. She unfortunately, she wrote up a biography, which I encourage everyone to read. It's a very intimate telling of her own journey, her own life. But that biography caused so much controversy. It basically ruined her business, ruined her credibility, because people thought, and even now you're revealing things that were behind closed doors. And of course, with the assassination of Lincoln, that added fuel to the fire. But to some extent in that moment, she had some bit of ownership in a time where most Black people couldn't achieve, weren't allowed because of the systematic oppression that existed. And I think that in this sense, I would love for you to kind of elaborate on the idea of community, what community was then, and also versus rethinking and redefining community over time, so that, I guess, coming to the latter part, of our conversation, I want to get into understanding community and how to redefine community today.
And I want to, I guess, put side by side community and culture, because I think culture is very important, and also the names that we have mentioned. Think of the parallel economy. So you have this system of oppression and slavery, chattel slavery, and lost ownership that you're operating in, but you have a valued skill that allows you to operate almost in a parallel economy, even though you're not free, You are owned, but also the value you create is owned by somebody else. But it gives you a certain ability to operate in a parallel way with some additional privileges because of your skill. I think a community is born out of that. The fact that one, we have in common that we've lost value, the value of of what we create. That, and community, I define it as affiliation and acceptance. So a certain affiliation and acceptance grows out of that common experience of Africans living a 600-year nightmare in the Western Hemisphere. That creates a certain sense of acceptance and affiliation against people, between people who have that common experience. Culture is important. And even in the context of community, culture is important. What is culture? Culture is beliefs, values, and attitudes. That's what culture is. So when you think about culture and community together, and that the transfer of beliefs, values, and attitudes to the Western Hemisphere, and how we had to find a way to operate, to live, to sustain ourselves, even though we're in a parallel economy that is not in any way equitable, but we do have these beliefs and values and attitude, and they show up. Culture shows up in our creation, in our creative ability. What we believe, what we value, and the attitudes we have show up in the garments that we wear. I have on a bright orange shirt. Today I said I want to be seen. So I put on a bright orange shirt. You can't miss it. Because that's how I felt today. That comes out of probably a cultural experience. I believe it's okay to wear a bright color. Today I value being seen. You can see it in my attitude. So culture definitely has an impact on our creation, and what we create in and of itself builds community. I think we to some degree we've forgotten that. We've lost that. And I'm sure we'll get to the conversation. But how many people grew up with a single sewing machine floor model in your house? All right. We're amongst, and this is for the elders. How many people took home economics? Miss Dorothy Thomas taught home ec. So you learned to sew, cook, write a check. You learned the economics of home. That was community building. Here's a story Francis will appreciate. We had a single sewing machine floor model, and the first pair of gym shorts that I owned, my mother sat me down at that single sewing machine, and I made the first pair of gym shorts that I wore to 9th grade gym class. We didn't go buy it. I had to make it. To this day, I can sew a hem, I can sew on a button. Transferable skills. That was community was built around that sewing machine, because if you didn't have one, Miss So-and-so down the street had one, and she would have she would see the young girls in particular out playing, and she would maybe teach them how to to use a pattern. I was talking to my sister today, younger sister, and she sews. And she was talking about how the price of fabric, and there is no more Joanne fabric. So we have to really begin to think and connect the dots on all of that, because it is community building.
And let's stay there for a moment, because I think that as we've been talking about this for the last, over our previous meetings, and thinking about, these aspects of home ec, sewing, that have that have been lost, really. Like I did not have home ec at my school, right? That wasn't something that was afforded, and my mom did not sew. She wasn't a sewer. She did hem my pants every now and then, but she wasn't a sewer. My grandmother was, but we didn't live near her, so it wasn't anything that I could learn on a day-to-day basis. But I'm curious to know, thinking about also, there was something that you said earlier on, we were meeting about the terminology of economy, that you identified it as people's behavior in pursuit of scarce resources. And so relating and connecting the two, the idea of, making your own clothes at home, right? That saves money, right? That's money that you can spend on other things, on things that you can amplify your own home, but also thinking about the idea of someone sewing, starting a business. You had plenty of tailors, right, and dressmakers, and certainly during the Jim Crow era, you could only go to those who look like you to get your clothes made, or you made them at home. Thinking about the idea of like the zoot suit as well, right? The zoot suit being a copy of the London drape suit, and being that obviously most African Americans and Latinos did not have the financial access to go to Savile Row to London to get a drape suit. You had your grandmother make it at home, and that's why the sleeves are a little bit bigger and everything was a little more billowed. But that said, as I mentioned, there's this lost art really that hasn't been passed down. And why do you think that is? And where do you think the break happened?
And this is something, so I've been in academia for 40 years, at HBCU for 30 years, actually also clergy, so I pastored a church for 17 of those 30 years, deeply community connected and involved. But I have to remind people all the time that economics is a social science. Economics is taught in business schools, but by any definition, it's a social science. So it's the behavior of people in the pursuit of scarce resources. That's the textbook definition of economics. So when we're in a deficit situation in terms of resources, we have to watch the behavior of people in pursuit of those resources. I'm going to back up just a minute so that we can connect the dots. Historically, there was a shift, and it was a European mindset. Something else happened around 1400 as well, 1434 or so. Mercantilism was globalized. Now, what is mercantilism? Mercantilism is the mindset or thought that there's a limited amount of everything, and in the only way I can advance myself is to take from you. That's mercantilism. So you can see that in the globalization of that philosophy as Europeans came to the continent of Africa, as they went to Asia, as they came to North America, the only way for me to advance my position is to take from somebody else, as opposed to a value add mindset, whereas if I add value, then everybody will advance. It's a different philosophy. Understanding that economics is a behavioral science puts it into the realm of understanding it, the social psychology of it. That's the work that we have to do as a community. We have to unpack or deconstruct the philosophy and the thinking and the psychology that came along with a mercantilistic mindset, as opposed to a communal mindset. We have to go all the way back and unlearn some things. Part of my research agenda is on learning competencies, learning how to learn. We really have to do a deep dive into that, so that you say, how do we move? How do we break this? How do we break this? It's only going to happen when we understand and begin to direct the learning process, and that is from here to the end. During segregation, when schools were segregated, you say, how in the world did black folk advance coming out of slavery, 1865, 12 years of Reconstruction, and then the troops pulled out of the South, and the next 100+ years of Jim Crow and segregation. How did we advance? The separate and unequal was the order of the day. But out of that, because of community, we had what was known as the greatest generation. Anybody know what who those people are, or who they were? The greatest generation. That's our parents' generation. I'm a baby boomer. They were part of the greatest generation. My mother lived to be 92, passed away in 2016. My father lived to be 100 years old, passed away in 2022. The greatest generation, born in 1921, 22, in that time frame. The black migration from the South and what they brought with them. How in the world did they position themselves to build a black middle class coming out of a segregated Jim Crow situation where people were being snatched up and lynched? How we come full circle. And we are slipping back into an apartheid situation. I was born into apartheid in America. I was born in 1958. So even though Brown versus Board of Education, it happened in 1954, it did not get everywhere. I did not go to an integrated school till I was in the 3rd grade. Welch Dunbar for the first 2 years. And a certain community came out of that experience that influenced what we're talking about now from an economic standpoint. And I think we just have to connect the dots. The economics is a behavioral science. We have to deconstruct from a psychological and a social framework, even when we begin to measure our wealth building. You hear a lot about that now, entrepreneurship and wealth building. There are entrepreneurship centers everywhere. One of the things I say to people, I do not want to have this same conversation 10 or 20 years from now. We have to start to really move the needle. So economics as a social science, I'll start there, but connecting that to community building, social psychology, and understanding that there must be a new learning paradigm that's going to push us in the right direction.
So how are you participating in that conversation today in terms of creating, or obviously creating a new learning paradigm through the work that you do, but also actively constructing a system of which can persist long beyond us and that others and future generations can continue to build on?
Okay, part of that goes to my journey, and even, okay, if I've been in higher ed for 40 years, the first, my undergrad, my master's, my doctorate, and my first 10 years, 11 years were in predominantly white institutions, private institutions. So I was in situations, and having integrated schools in the third grade, I was in situations where I was around hostile white adults from the age of 8 to 38. Think about it, 8 to 38. When I left Johns Hopkins University, there, I did not realize how traumatized I had been for 3 decades. I did not realize the impact of it. I did not realize how burned out I was. So when I landed at Coppin State University, a small urban HBCU, and I always say I hunkered down. I left, I said, I'm going to a HBCU, and I'm gonna hunker down in the black church, and y'all don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm not coming back out. The only thing that pushed me back out was when I became dean, and I had to go out and grip and grin and shake hands and raise, that sort of thing. But I share that to say one of the things that I'm most proud of is my 30 years at that HBCU, an anchor institution in one of the most underinvested areas of Baltimore, West Baltimore, that now has an opportunity because we are an anchor institution in a black city, in an area that's known as the donut hole. And it's known as the donut hole because all of the investment has happened around it, and it's been ignored for decades. So you have Hopkins to the east, you have the University of Maryland, Baltimore to the south, you have the biomedical park, you have all of this but the donut hole, and that's where Coppin resides. So when I came out of the dean seat, I kept some pet projects, and that became the Entrepreneurship Center. I knew that we could not, we don't try to be like everybody else. And so we carved out a niche. We launched the Entrepreneurship Center. I said, we're going to carve out a niche in local production, community level production, and we're going to focus on food and the sewing trades in terms of local production. And that's where we have focused. Now, a lot of things have happened at Coppin State University. Maryland is a different state. It's not like others. We're a smaller state, but we have a black mayor. The legislature is, the Black Caucus has power. We have a black governor. So some things are happening in a particular way that have not happened in the past. We are not in states where a red state, a blue dot in a red state. And even though we swing back and forth from time to time on the state level in terms of the governor's seat, it's still, so I'm seeing a different type of leadership. It has provided an opportunity for us, and I'm sure you'll get to the smart garment district, but we have something. There's a developing smart garment district We have something called the West North Avenue Development Authority. We have progressive leadership at this HBCU. So I'm overjoyed about the platform right now. I recognize this as an opportunity, even though I'm going to go home at some point. I'm not going to do this forever. That time may be close. Who knows? But I'm glad to have the opportunity at this juncture to do some unique work.
In staying on the smart garment district, I think we were talking earlier about the changes and so much happening in Maryland, because I used to live there myself. And when I was younger, there was this shift in, of course, gentrification happening. I lived in PG County, so a little south of Baltimore, right outside of DC. So we watched Southeast DC, as we talked earlier, just transform into something completely different once they built the national the baseball team, their stadium. That was it, and I had relatives that were priced out and had to leave, and and it's interesting all over the state of Maryland. As I was growing up, you saw a lot of gentrification happening little by little, but specifically in Baltimore, there's definitely a lot of different shifts that have happened. But to your point, there is a force of change that looks like us, right? That is there advocating on behalf of the Black community. But that said, with what you're doing at Coppin with the Smart Garment District, how do you see that galvanizing over the long term and then setting a precedent for the future for succeeding generations?
Well, let's talk about what a smart garment district is.
Let's do it.
So soon is now, your clothes will be able to do things like take your blood pressure and other heart rate. You'll be able to plug into your clothing and charge your phone. There's a company in Baltimore right now that we collaborate with that makes fire retardant clothing. That's a smart garment. So the chemicals that they use, and they work with the Department of Defense, because you could put a blowtorch to this fabric and it won't burn. So clothing is being technology infused. On our campus, we have the Center for Nanotechnology, and this gentleman uses plant dye to make solar batteries. And those batteries could be put in clothing, especially in remote areas. And like I said, you could use your clothes to charge your phone. So that's a smart garment. How do we become part of that conversation? And that's what we're working on at Coppin. And it's what's called a quadruple helix approach, where you have an academic institution, a public partner, private partner, and the community, those four elements, to become part of the economic conversation. As this evolves, it's a lot of moving parts to it. Legislatively, the senator from our district, Senator Antonio Hayes, established, he passed a bill, he worked on legislation, had it passed, a bill passed, for the creation of the West North Avenue Development Authority. That means any development that happens in that corridor in West Baltimore must go through that authority so that the community has a voice in the development. The president, or the chair of that authority, is the president of Coppin State University. So you have the university, you have the community, you have the development authority. Also, the same senator funded a feasibility study for the creation of a smart garment district. And I work with that advisory board for the creation of that district. So you can see how that's very different than how development happens very often. Too often we're late to the table. We didn't even know, and the building is up, and we said, well, where did that come from? We weren't, nobody talked to any, but now we're in. Now, economic development, fashion industry, there are a couple of things we have to think about. And I mentioned, we were talking earlier, allyship. We have to assess and have new ways of assessing allyship. Who's with us? There's a book from Fire in the Belly, and said two things you have to figure out. You can never get them confused. Where am I going? And who's going with me? If you ever get those two out of order, you're in trouble. You first must know where you're going, and then figure out who's going with me. Everybody can't go, and you make trade-offs when you allow certain people to go. But you have to be very clear about the trade-off that you're making when you have certain allies. The other part of that conversation is the conversation that we have to have internally in our community, because things don't always work out there right either. So as we build this, and I'm still on the smart garment district, we have to have those conversations in both directions. I mentioned, and I will withhold the names to protect the innocent. But we're in collaboration with an organization that's led by this corporate funded, led by not people of color. But they've been allies. They've been allies. They've made mistakes, but you can't be my ally unless you are willing to, in a full-throated way, accept your mistakes. Then we may be able to work together. Then there are people who are of color, who are in the community, who have been attempting to do the same thing that the ally did, but they don't get the funding and they don't get the support. The academic institution stands in the middle and becomes the trust broker. How do you get those two with that type of tension to work together for the building of a smart garment district? It ain't easy, because you have historical distrust for good reason, and then you have allies who have privilege, who are going to come into the community and bump around, make mistakes, do things you have to say, ho, don't do that. Don't do that. So the academic institution, I believe, becomes that trust broker who is able to broker the conversation between those kinds of potential allies and potential partners. But it's walking a tightrope, because we have a certain trust collateral that we can expend in the community because of who we are. And you don't want to lose that when you bring in someone from the outside and they offend everybody.
It's true. Well, I do want to open it up to questions in a moment, but as we do, I want to kind of end on your thoughts on what you foresee for, the Smart Garment District, and broadly for bringing and revitalizing this kind of lost sector within black expansion and black wealth, really.
Yeah. Think about this, and I'm glad, because I think this is an important example. In the garment industry, there's a leap between sewing, residential sewing, and industrial sewing at home and learning how to use an industrial machine. Then there's another leap to emerging technology. West Virginia University is working on this technology, draping technology, that allows you to size virtually with more accuracy. So as you scale, you don't have to return your returns because your sizing has been more accurate. Then there's the need for a skill. Talk about reskilling and upskilling. So you need someone who understands industrial sewing, who understands the emerging technology, but can also run my plant. So they have to have these technology managed. That person does not exist. So even as you revitalize the garment industry and apparel making and fashion, give people an outlet for their fashion sensibilities, we don't have a workforce for what's on the horizon. And we have to run to the opportunity to develop that workforce. We have to expose our young people, our emerging entrepreneurs to this. We have to expose them. Otherwise, they won't have any understanding or know that it's there. I use this terminology. We're not preparing young people for success, because if you say that, you're just setting them up for further frustration. Because everybody has a different idea about what success is. And I cannot guarantee you, but I can guarantee, we use this terminology, opportunity ready. We want you to be opportunity ready. So we're going to expose you to the smart garment industry. We're going to expose you to the vertical, from production to making to distribution. We're going to expose you to that, and then we're going to let your creativity take you to where you belong. So that's one thing. But we must think in terms of micro businesses, reestablishing the community connections, and making sure black institutions, the community that I grew up in, that many of us are familiar with, does not exist. Grew up in a community where, you knew the people when you walked past their homes. Chances are they were the cafeteria workers at school. You saw them in church on Sunday morning. That was the community. Everybody knew everybody. Somebody could correct you. That does not exist. So what does community mean now, and how do we, through our institutions, interinstitutionally, education, religious institutions, faith-based institutions, and otherwise in the community, get connected and establish the relational intelligence that we need to be able to build an economy and a wealth-building paradigm and process that will move us forward, and assess that. Some educators in here, you know about assessment. So how do we assess that? There's economic impact, there's social impact, there's technological impact. So we have to have a new paradigm for assessing progress.
I receive that. I want to open it up to questions for anyone. Yes? Oh, do you have a mic? Right?
I just ask that you repeat back some of the questions, so our YouTube friends and listeners can hear the full question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rita. We are both boomers, only I was born in 1949. attended all black schools until I went to Kent to negotiate how white people act. Anyway, you know. So the one thing, when you were talking about fashion and smart garments and everything, I attended Kent State University, which has a renowned fashion school. In fact, I was the librarian there. The one thing I know that's missing, because it took place in the 80s and everybody knows I'm a talk history, but the one thing I remember is everything sort of went down the drain, because everybody here where I live had a neighborhood. And it wasn't that people worked at the same place, it's just they lived in the same place. But there's a number of assets that a lot of people don't know, and that's missing because no one has put the list together or been in the schools, because they don't put too much of the list of what they even have. When you were talking about smart garments, I was looking up to see what Kent has, because I haven't been there in a minute. But I noticed the same thing you were talking about they had. So I'm wondering, in various schools like junior high, to show how old I am, but junior high and high school, are there ways to put or bring in people that are in the fashion world to acclimate them in understanding what is available in their area in regards to smart? Because it's a connection to what technology is now and how most of the youth are into it. So if nobody's giving them the information, they'll never know about it. So I'm wondering, has anybody put a plan together or started something? I'm trying to start something, but I'm wondering, do you know if it's going around in regards to that, especially now?
Yes, thank you, Rita. Absolutely. We are, so we recognize, again, the educational system as an institution that we have to connect the dots. We're higher ed, but right around us there are, 4 or 5 high schools, and in terms of their areas, especially the CTE schools, one is manufacturing, a couple of them are manufacturing, engineering, management. We're working with the Baltimore City school system to hopefully establish an apprenticeship model. And we're looking at the apparel sector particularly because apprenticeship programs in Maryland are under the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor can't necessarily make the mental leap to apprenticeships that have anything to do with entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is a little bit too subjective for them. So we have to choose industries that make sense to them and also have some, I guess, some semblance of what an apprenticeship process could look like. So the garment industry is prime for that. Is good for that. We're working on it now. There's a website called greaterspacesandplaces.com. On greaterspacesandplaces.com, you will see our body of work. There's our most recent report, which is called Excellence in Entrepreneurial Learning, Excel for short. With the support of the Casey Foundation, we produced Excel 1.0. We are designing Excel 2.0 right now, which will further explore the development of this apprenticeship model. That's the way we do it. Now, Excel 1.0 was a landscape analysis of entrepreneurship instructional programs in Baltimore City. And what we found was the Wild West. They were all over the place. You had year-long programs, you had after-school programs, you had school-based programs, you had grassroots nonprofits. Everybody's doing entrepreneurship, but the people who fund it, the funders, don't know what their return on investment is. So if we aren't careful, they will say eventually, well, we invested all of this money and nothing has changed. Well, we have to take control of the way that's assessed. And I believe that that's what we're building. I'm working with a brilliant founder of an organization called Equity Brain Trust. And we're developing a data framework that will allow us to track in those different approaches to preparing entrepreneurs in a sector like the garment sector, apparel sector in particular. So that's how we do it. We develop measurable frameworks. We look at industries such as fashion industry that where we can put in models that are recognized, but then we do the assessment work.
Oh. It's okay.
My question is for Darnell. I'd like to know what your pathway was to get to where you are now, because you are not a sewer, did not take home economics or have a sewing machine in your home. What made you interested? Was it someone you followed, or how did you become interested to get to where you are now?
So, keeping right, following directions. How did I get? No, I'll repeat it. Don't worry. Yeah. How did I become interested in the pathway that I'm in now? So, as a fashion curator, so my job isn't. My role isn't in design and creation. My role is more aligned with the academic side of the field in terms of educating, the broad public on the history of fashion, its nuances, particularly in relation to art history. And I had an affinity for history and storytelling in general. And I think that I'm fascinated by the way, I've always been fascinated by the way that clothes tell a lot of different stories. They tell intimate stories, they tell geopolitical stories, and I think that my interests were so broad, I didn't quite know where I could facilitate that interest. My mom was like, "Oh, you should be a history teacher." Mom, as everybody in in the DMV, what do? Your parents work for the government, So, my mom was at the time working for the Secretary of Health and Human Services, but she was like, "Do you want to work for the FBI?" I was like, "No." And so, I loved museums. I love being in them. I know it's tricky history with the history of museums in the Western culture. But we did. My parents did well, but we weren't we didn't do that well where we can go to Europe every summer. So my way of almost transporting across time and space was going to museums. And so I really wanted to put both of those worlds together. I loved material culture and understanding how clothes could tell stories, but I also enjoyed storytelling within the museum structure. So honestly, by the grace of God, I don't know. I was just watching television, And I think it was years ago. I forgot which Costume Institute exhibition. The Costume Institute is the fashion department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they do the big spring shows. And then to open those spring shows, they have the Costume Institute Gala, aka the Met Gala. So I think I was watching some red carpet, and I was just like, why are these people here at this museum? I've never seen this many people at a museum before. And so I did a bit of research and understood what the Costume Institute was. And I went down that rabbit hole. And so when I was in high school, I taught for the Smithsonian. And then when I graduated, I moved to New York. And I went to the Fashion Institute of Technology and basically started my academic journey there in different fashion history degrees and experience. I ended up working for the Costume Institute at some point in time, the museum at FIT, and just growing my own interest, particularly in illuminating, my community story, right? Our community story within the history of fashion, because it's so rich, but it's not taught because, even in the classes that I took, it was we're going to talk about Marie Antoinette and we're going to go all the way down, to Cher. And you're just kind of like, that's lovely. But, I know that we exist within these stories. I know we exist within the contributions because I see them copy us, right? So clearly this is not a point of origin. No, we didn't get to the whole appropriation, appreciation, particularly around protecting our contributions. But that spurred that continued my interest. So within a lot of the work that I did, it melded into fashion curation and working for different museums and building fashion departments, executing exhibitions, which eventually led me to the Cleveland Museum of Art to be their first fashion curator. Of course.
I have several questions, so I'll take my first one. I think I try to sneak in my second. But my first question is, in listening to the history of fashion and what you described in terms of migration and all of that, and your sewing and how, can you elaborate if you have had a chance to explore the intersections of arts and crafts, i.e. quilting and fashion, as relates to us historically as people, because someone down that path, if you were from a quilting and that storytelling through quilting and storytelling through fashion, those intersections, if you have anything to share related to that intersection. And the second is, has there been any thought about the nuance of fashion in Cleveland and say the Cleveland, Detroit, because there are nuances of fashion for us as an opportunity to explore the history of fashion shows and things like that were very vibrant in the Cleveland community at some point and brought us connected. And is there any opportunity to exploring that and putting that on display at the Art Museum to talk about the history and connections of Cleveland and fashion and its nuance?
I was like, that is yours. So, the first question. Right. So if I recall, first question. Oh my gosh, my brain. Quilting, right. And about the idea of arts and crafts in the intersection. There's been explorations on that nationally. Back in my hometown, I'm from Atlanta originally, in the High Museum of Art, they've done a lot of work on G-bins, quilting, which is a community down south, historically that are descendants of the enslaved, of this enslaved plantation, actually several plantations, and their entire economy is based on quilting. In making crafts. And so I believe, I forgot, it's a commercial designer that made the dress that First Lady Michelle Obama wore for her portrait. That particular dress is specifically inspired by G. Ben's quilt. So they had the tour of the Obama's portraits that was touring all over the country. They went to the High Museum and they connected the story of quilting with, with that particular portrait, with those portraits, with her portrait specifically. But yes, there has been different projects about arts and crafts, particularly as it pertains to the Black community. I believe the African American Museum in California, in LA, has done work on said thing. And then, I'm sorry, so I have like 15 million thoughts in my head at the same time. I want to say Akron did something specifically on quilting, but don't quote me on that. But I want to say it was something recently within the last handful of years. And then in San Francisco, they also did something at the Museum of the Afro Diaspora on this particular intersection. And so there are, and then also I want to point to a colleague of mine, Dr. Jonathan Michael Square. His work explores really the intersection that you're talking about, and really delves into the contributions of Black people over the course of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So he's about to publish his book soon, but he's written a lot about this work. And remember when you were talking about earlier about burlap, obviously being produced in Lowell, Massachusetts, he did a entire lecture when I was back in New York, I forgot for what organization, on Brooks Brothers creating enslaved dress for those who, for like the individuals who would like, what do you call it? Horse carriage, the butlers. So they would, plantation owners and slave owners would, send in, pay for their enslaved, the individuals that they owned, institutionalized slavery, obviously. They would pay for the wares. They would pay for what they would actually don, as very much a modicum of European hierarchical structure. Because in Europe, for hundreds of years, whoever was the principal of that estate or principal of that family, you would want your servants to be a reflection of you. So they took on that mindset, and Brooks Brothers made a killing off of it. And so he talks a lot about that in his work and a lot of his papers that he's written. And so certainly there's many of my colleagues across the country that have talked particularly about this intersection. And also there's another show that's traveling around the world that, expanding this out a little bit to the Afro diaspora, even beyond the African American context. You have the African fashion exhibition that's been traveling that has extremely great resources about this intersection dating that explores a range of designers and creatives that are kind of in limbo spaces or situated right in the fashion industry, all looking at different practices, historical practices, and using them as a means of creation and innovation. In terms of the CMA now, child, I do got to go to work tomorrow. But they will. This is what I'll say about Lord. This is what I'll say about the CMA. I'll say this. Before I even get to the CMA, there's other incredible resources, I think, that are exploring said topics that you mentioned. Like what Patty Edmondson is doing at the Cleveland History Center or the Western Reserve Historical Society, particularly in the last few years since I've landed here in the city, has been really, really inspiring. She did a show on Amanda Wicker, who I wasn't very familiar with. I knew Zelda Wynn Valdez, her contemporary in New York, because I've done research on her, but I didn't know who Amanda Wicker was because obviously I'm not from Cleveland. But understanding her story in relation to creating, back to the point of like education, creating a schools and creating a pipeline for young women to get into dressmaking. And then, of course, linking their careers and their futures with those happening in New York, I think is incredibly inspirational. And so you have what she was doing, of course, you know, what I know Kent State University Museum leadership has changed a little bit, but when I got here, there was definitely a few resources that I thought was incredible as well. And I'm sure they're thinking about what to do in the future, because I know they're in a bit of state of transition right now. Now, the Cleveland Museum of Art, tricky business. There have been a lot of conversations across the board, not only with what I'm doing, but also with other curators as well, because we kind of move as a unit. It's not, you know, one individual's over here doing this, the arm is doing this, the leg's doing this. It's like we all are in this together. And there has been like a shift about, you know, how we talk about and discuss, well, Cleveland stories and Midwestern stories. And so I don't know what the future holds. You know, I like to say that there is always a possibility to explore it more in depth in the way that I know that the community deserves. But that said, there's a whole lot of stakeholders. And I think that once we break through what it is that we hope for, I think the possibilities are endless. But I don't like to make promises on the spot.
Can I add something to the quilting and craft conversation? And I say that because, all right, so I'm from Southern West Virginia, and I think this has implications for the future as well. There's seriously a crafting and quilting tradition from a rural perspective in Southern West Virginia. How many people are familiar with the industrial history of West Virginia at all? Okay, so of course, there was a large African American population in Southern West Virginia, McDowell County, Mercer County, in particular, because of the coal mines. My grandfather was a coal mining preacher who moved 4 times. And he landed in McDowell County, West Virginia, the most southern county in the state, because there were 5 black high schools and an HBCU nearby. Now, when you think about quilting and crafts from a rural hill tradition and now, of course, black people are economic migrants. So when they automated the coal mines, black people moved away. So the county that I grew up in had 125,000 people or so. At its height, is now down to like 15, between 10 to 15,000. Same devastation that you may see in any urban area. Addiction, failing schools, abandoned buildings, the same dynamics are there. All right, the HBCU there, Bluefield State University now, there's an article in NPR, in 2013, NPR, the whitest HBCU in America. 99% white. All right, it parallels the history of Coppin State University because both of them started out as teachers' colleges. So you have 2 HBCUs, both born at the same time, but one ends up 99% white. We're still majority black in an urban area, supporting an economy. There used to be a connection between urban and rural because the coal that was mined in Southern West Virginia was shipped to Baltimore to be turned into steel. So I have a relationship with some, I'll say, apparel industry people there who are trying to jumpstart their apparel industry the same way we are revitalizing the industry in Baltimore. But now the black population is gone. The HBCU is majority white. And I raise that because as we think about quilting, crafts, the traditions, where they reside, how we support them educationally, getting people involved, the ground has shifted. And it's a much more nuanced conversation because the world that existed does not exist anymore. And we really have to think about ahead of the game. How do we do this? How do we recreate that economic connection and pipeline between those types of areas? Do we do it? What kind of institutions are involved? Is there a Coppin State and a Bluefield State that have a similar history? Both HBCUs. Bluefield State still receives federal money as an HBCU because they're historically black. But we have to think about, when I talked about allyship, connections, what's the value proposition in making those connections when we think about quilting and crafts? We just have to think ahead a bit as we reestablish them.
Hi, good evening. I have a question. I know you observed the Met in one of your responses, and I wanted to know if either of you have had an opportunity to get there to see the Superfine exhibit that is on display. So I was still in August to see it, and what you thought about this year's Met Gala theme, like Danny. Okay, I'm interested in that. And then secondly, also talked about our inability to protect our designs and things. I'm curious to know how that happens. I'm interior design and I have a home decor line that so I usually space. Love fashion, dressing, but I'm professional in that space. What are ways in which designers, rather than the fashion side, are able to protect what it is that they create, and how does that work? If you have any insight. And we do have the wonderful Angel also works from Scripted first step, along with your brother there.
Okay, so first question. Have we seen the Superfine exhibition? I haven't I'm planning on going to New York probably soon because of work stuff. So I'll see it then. But I'll report back. Maybe a cute little article or something. I mean, it's funny because I talked about it ad nauseum, in terms of before, because usually it's like it's a cycle, because when I worked there at the Met, it was a brief time. I worked on research for the Heavenly Bodies Fashion and the Catholic Imagination exhibition, which was they opened in summer 2018, spring summer 2018. So I was there in 2017. But the schedule is so tight. Like they do shows because the Costume Institute at the Met it's its own department, as all the other art departments. It has its own staff, which is different. Whereas the other art departments at the Met share their staff. So they're able to do exhibitions in like a 10-month time span, which is very quick for a curator. Usually it takes us about 2 to 3 years to do an exhibition. They can do it in about 10 months. So at the end, that's when the press starts happening and they reach out and they ask me a bunch of questions about it. And I will say that, I know Monica Miller, who's the guest curator for the show, worked with the chief curator, who I respect, Andrew Bolton, of the Costume Institute. So he brought her in to really do that into the conversation of allyship. It was like a very great thing that I commend Andrew for doing, particularly at an institution like the Met, right? It's the largest art museum on this side of the world. And so, he's never, executed an exhibition, in that foray of illuminating. So bringing someone with that knowledge who wrote the book on Black dandyism, right? She wrote the book Slaves to Fashion, which we all as fashion historians have used, again, ad nauseum. And so I think that even though I haven't seen it, I know it's a very well thought, and she's also a professor at Columbia. I don't know if she considers herself a dress historian more or less than a African-American historian, but that said, I know it's going to be a well-researched exhibition, and you're going to really see the nuances and ways that I believe that allow us to be seen in the fullness as much as we can, or as much as we can be seen in that particular environment. So I think it's going to be a beautiful show. In terms of the red carpet, God bless all the stylists and all the celebrities. It's a tricky thing. I mean, obviously Anna Wintour, who's the editor-in-chief of Vogue, the relationship is Condé Nast and Vogue organize a party, and that doubles as a fundraiser, which is great because that money goes back to the Costume Institute because those exhibitions are very expensive. Fashion exhibitions in general are extremely expensive, as one who has to look at budget sheets all day. And so, you know, in terms of the actual red carpet, it's a tricky situation because the way stylists get their information about the theme ahead in advance, then they dress their clients. It's tricky water. So I don't place too much judgment on it because it's kind of like, it is what it is. It's a night and it's for them, and you just kind of focus on what I think is more important about that particular aura, which is the exhibition. You know, that's where our research lives, and thankfully there's an exhibition catalog, so that research continues on, and other people down the line can use it and come back to it. In terms of your second question, you asked about protecting essentially copyright and intellectual property. Here in America, just in general, we have terrible protections around protecting intellectual property, just for anybody, not just our own community. There was a time some years ago that the Council of Fashion Designers of America were trying to work with Congress to enforce particularly a series of laws, a bill that would protect fashion designers, because there's just so many that are young, that are starting businesses, and, you know, financially you need everything, you know, to really go your way to make it to the next level, because, you know, America is a very commercialized society. You know, 1 minute we're over here, next minute we're over there. You don't know what's going to hit or what's not going to hit. So whereas in other countries like France and Italy and England, where fashion has been ingrained as a premier industry, they have extremely tight regulations around intellectual property creation. And so the Council of Fashion Designers of America were trying to kind of create something compatible to the system of laws and bills that have already been implemented in Europe. And Congress basically laughed in their face. It was just like, keep it pushing. And I think that it really starts with us, and kind of going back to the point of allyship, is really kind of fostering and creating a basis of community allyship that more people can come on board to create bills that and expand the support so that we can protect many young designers, particularly Black designers, you know, and Black creators. You know, it's a multi-pronged process.
And let me add to that, from an institutional perspective. And I was introduced to intellectual property, tech transfer, commercialization in the mid-'80s to mid-'90s when I was at Hopkins. And then when I came into HBCU world, it didn't exist because Okay, one, from an individual perspective, and if you're looking for a black IP attorney, there aren't many around. And then if you find one, can you afford one? If you are part of an institution like I am, for example, Jamal Uden, who's the technology professor at Coppin, we don't have, and most HBCUs do not have, tech transfer offices, commercialization offices, or the infrastructure necessary to protect IP. So if you are a student, fashion or otherwise, working with the professor, you don't have the same resources available to you to protect, and it's called academic entrepreneurship, to protect what you are producing. If you are a public institution, the state system may have something that you can access, but it's very difficult to access it. So I offer that as we look to solve for this, one thing we're doing is all of our research is done in the interest of influencing public policy. Everything we do, we put our research teams together for that purpose. We do applied research for that purpose, because that's the end game, to influence public policy so that we will have better protections, so that we will have avenues for practitioners who may not be able to afford that kind of support individually, but may be able to come to an institution and collaborate and get access to it. So as we move forward, that may be part of our path forward, is to build up those resources in black institutions. There is an IP attorney, black IP attorney in Maryland, who used to work for, what's the IBM? So he's on his own. He has a company called IPGen. Now, he has a platform that will allow you to apply for your provisional patent at a much reduced rate. And that may take some of the barrier down. So it gives us a technological leap. So we don't have to hire a staff of IP attorneys at the institution to support this kind of work. So we're just going to have to be smart about our path forward when it comes to protecting our intellectual property.
And to put a button in that, that's the other part, is it, like to the early part of our discussion, is that sometimes that intellectual property aspect of design might have to merge with another industry and has to be kind of embedded, because that was another strategy the CFDA tried to do, which was align, from my understanding, align fashion intellectual property with technology. And something happened where interest divided. They went on different paths, and kind of fashion was left out to dry a little bit. So I think it's all about strategy of like, where does fashion and other kind of creative intellectual properties lie and merge with other industries, and then kind of like coming in through the back door, because I don't want to say unfortunately, but because of the social constructs of what America is and how we value creativity, it's going to be a little bit of a sneakier back door than it would be in a place like Italy, where fashion is their number one industry. So I think it's just, it really falls back on cultural values. But I think where there's a will, there's a way. Yeah. I think that's it.
This week, so make sure that you come out June 22nd, I believe, from 12 to 6. There's going to be activities, food, fun for everybody. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, ThirdSpace. Make sure that you patronize ThirdSpace on a regular basis, not just when there's an event. Hello, amen, all of that, because that's how we start. That's how we start cultivating the culture and building back those communities. So thank you all for being here this evening. Have